1958, Chicago. A small hospital room on the west side of the city. The air smells of antiseptic and winter. Machines hum softly in the background. On the bed lies a 72-year-old man staring at the ceiling. His body is failing, but his mind is sharp, clear, focused, clear enough to understand exactly what he built, clear enough to realize what he's about to leave behind. Outside the window, an industrial empire stretches across Chicago. Massive brick factories, smokestacks, rail lines feeding raw materials into the heart of American manufacturing. 11,000 workers will clock in tomorrow morning. 7 massive plants will roar back to life. And in nearly 20 million American homes, a familiar name will glow on television screens. The man in the bed knows that name better than anyone. His name is Commander Eugene F. McDonnell, Jr., a naval officer by title, a showman by instinct, an industrialist by sheer force of will. This was not a cautious man. This was a man who once drove a car up the steps of a public monument just to get arrested, because he knew the photograph would sell automobiles. A man who broadcast music from Greenland into American living rooms just to prove it could be done. A man who took a kitchen table radio hobby and turned it into one of the most respected electronics companies in U.S. history. For decades, his company stood for one idea above all else. The quality goes in before the name goes on. It wasn't marketing, it was a promise, and America believed it. But here's the part no one expected. Less than 40 years later, those same factories would stand silent. Windows smashed, roofs collapsed, teenagers lighting fires in hallways where engineers once perfected the technology that shaped modern television. The last workers gone, the machines scrapped, the company sold overseas for less than the cost of its debts. So what happened? Was this simply the unavoidable price of globalization, or did someone, somewhere, decide that an American giant was no longer worth saving? Because the fall of Zenith wasn't just a business failure, it was a warning. And to understand how it happened, we have to go back to the beginning. Chicago, 1918. Chicago was a city of smoke, steel, and noise. Immigrants poured into factories by the thousands. Fortunes were built and destroyed in a single generation. While American soldiers fought in Europe, 2 young men were working late nights in a small South Side apartment. Their names were Carl Hassel and Ralph Matthews. They weren't businessmen, they weren't wealthy, they were obsessed with radio. At a time when wireless communication felt almost magical, they spent their evenings building homemade radio equipment, soldering parts by hand, experimenting with signals that bounced invisibly through the air. They sold their gear to fellow hobbyists under a simple name, Chicago Radio Laboratory. Their amateur radio call sign was 9ZN. From those 4 characters, they created a brand name, Zenith. They had technical talent, they had curiosity. What they didn't have was money or business sense. What they did have was something incredibly rare: legal access to the patents of radio pioneer Edwin Armstrong, the man who would help define modern broadcasting. That license caught the attention of someone else. Someone who immediately understood what radio could become. Eugene McDonnell did not grow up privileged. Born poor in Syracuse, New York, he hated school. At 14, he dropped out and went to work in a factory. But McDonnell had something that couldn't be taught: instinct. By his 20s, he had moved to Chicago and was selling cars, using outrageous publicity stunts that guaranteed newspaper headlines. He understood something most industrialists didn't. Products don't sell themselves. Stories do. When the United States entered World War I, MacDonald joined Naval Intelligence. His technical skills earned him a commission. When he left the service, he insisted on keeping the title Lieutenant Commander. For the rest of his life, people would call him simply Commander MacDonald. In 1921, he invested his personal savings into Chicago Radio Laboratory. He didn't just invest, he took control. 2 years later, the company was renamed Zenith Radio Corporation. MacDonald owned the largest share. He was 37 years old, and he was just getting started. The 1920s radio market was chaos. Dozens of companies competed on technical details most consumers barely understood. MacDonald knew engineering alone wouldn't win. Zenith needed an identity, so he turned himself into the brand. In 1923, he became president of the National Association of Broadcasters. He convinced Arctic explorer Donald Macmillan to carry Zenith radios on polar expeditions. When crackling transmissions came through from the frozen north, Zenith made sure every American newspaper printed one detail clearly. These radios survived the Arctic. That single sentence carried enormous weight. In an era when radios were fragile, temperamental machines, easily knocked out by heat, cold, or humidity, the idea that a device could survive months of brutal Arctic wind felt almost impossible. Temperatures far below zero, ice forming inside metal housings, batteries failing, signals disappearing into static. And yet Zenith radios kept working. MacDonald understood that this was more than a technical achievement. It was a story the country needed to hear. Newspapers described radios crackling to life inside polar tents. Explorers huddled around speakers as music traveled thousands of miles through frozen darkness. Technology finally proving itself against nature itself. MacDonald himself went even further. He arranged broadcasts from Greenland directly into American homes. Families gathered around their radios, listening in disbelief as music crossed oceans and ice fields to reach their living rooms. It felt like magic. Zenith wasn't just selling radios anymore, it was selling adventure. It was selling reliability. And most of all, it was selling confidence. The belief that American engineering could conquer distance, climate, and uncertainty. Behind the spectacle, however, there was something far more important: real innovation. Zenith engineers focused relentlessly on practical improvements that mattered to everyday users. They built the first truly portable radio, not a novelty, but a device that could actually travel with its owner. They created the first home radio powered directly from household electrical current, eliminating the need for messy, unreliable batteries. They introduced push-button tuning, ending the frustration of fine-tuning delicate dials while signals drifted in and out of clarity. Each change made radio simpler, more accessible, more human. And tying it all together was a philosophy MacDonald repeated endlessly, both publicly and inside his factories. The quality goes in before the name goes on. It was not an advertising slogan written by a copywriter. It was a rule. If a product didn't meet Zenith's internal standards, it didn't ship, regardless of cost or delays. That obsession would define the company's rise and eventually its fall. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, the radio industry imploded almost overnight. Consumers stopped buying luxury goods. Retailers canceled orders, factories went silent, companies that had expanded recklessly disappeared in months. Zenith nearly joined them. Sales dropped by 80%. For 5 consecutive years, the company posted losses. The future looked grim. But Zenith had one crucial advantage that most competitors lacked: no debt. McDonald had always hated borrowing. Expansion was slow, deliberate, and funded internally. That single decision saved the company. While competitors folded, Zenith endured. Workers accepted pay cuts rather than layoffs. Executives tightened budgets instead of chasing risky growth. Loyalty replaced panic. The factories stayed open. By the mid-1930s, Zenith returned to profitability, and by 1941 it stood as the second largest radio manufacturer in America, surpassed only by RCA. Then came war. World War II transformed Zenith completely. Almost overnight, consumer production stopped. Factories that once built radios were converted to produce radar systems, military communications equipment, and precision electronic instruments. The scale was unlike anything Zenith had ever experienced. The workforce exploded. Thousands of new workers were hired, many of them women entering factory jobs for the first time. Assembly lines ran around the clock. Zenith learned how to operate as a true industrial powerhouse, managing logistics, quality control, and massive production volumes under intense pressure. Yet, even in wartime, Eugene McDonald was thinking ahead. While competitors went silent, Zenith kept advertising, not to sell products, but to keep its name alive. When peace returned, Zenith would not need to reintroduce itself to America. It was already there. After the war, consumer demand exploded. Americans wanted modern homes, modern appliances, and above all, television. Zenith entered the television market early but cautiously. McDonald distrusted advertising-supported TV. He believed constant commercials cheapened the medium. Instead, he experimented with subscription television, decades before cable networks or streaming platforms existed. The technology was ahead of its time. The market was not. Eventually, Zenith accepted reality and embraced conventional television. And this is where everything changed, because Zenith refused to compromise. While competitors adopted cheaper printed circuit boards, Zenith insisted on hand-wired chassis. Every connection was soldered by skilled workers, every unit inspected carefully. The process was slower, far more expensive, but the results were undeniable. Zenith televisions lasted years longer than competitors. Technicians noticed, repair shops noticed, consumers noticed. A Zenith TV wasn't cheap, but it rarely broke. And then came the invention that would permanently change how people interacted with their televisions. In 1950, Zenith introduced the world's first television remote control. It was revolutionary and deeply flawed. The remote was wired to the television with a long cable that stretched across living room floors. People tripped over it, pets chewed it, families hated it. Zenith knew the future had to be wireless. They tried radio waves. Interference made it unreliable. They tried light beams. Sunlight ruined it. Then engineer Robert Adler proposed something completely different: ultrasonic sound. High-frequency clicks, inaudible to humans, transmitted commands instantly. In 1956, Zenith launched Space Command. It worked flawlessly. That distinctive clicking sound people remember? That wasn't a flaw. That was Zenith. Millions of units were sold. Amazingly, many of them still function today. Zenith didn't just improve television, It changed the relationship between humans and machines. Technology no longer required effort, it responded. In 1958, Eugene MacDonald died unexpectedly. He left behind an empire and no clear successor. Zenith continued innovating: color television, improved picture tubes, unmatched reliability. By the early 1960s, more than 11,000 Chicago families depended on Zenith for their livelihoods. Entire neighborhoods were built around factory schedules. Then the world changed again. In the 1970s, container ships began unloading televisions from Japan onto American docks. Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba. Their televisions were smaller, cheaper, good enough. Zenith couldn't match their prices without abandoning everything it believed in. Instead of retooling factories, Zenith turned to the courts. For over a decade, the company accused foreign manufacturers of dumping products below cost. The case reached the Supreme Court. In 1986, Zenith lost. The ruling was devastating. The market would not protect them. Cuts followed immediately. Research budgets slashed, engineers laid off, factories closed one by one. Ironically, Zenith achieved one final technological triumph during this decline: digital HTDV transmission. Every digital television broadcast in America still relies on Zenith-developed standards, but the company ran out of time. In 1999, Zenith filed for bankruptcy. The last American television manufacturer was gone. Today, the factories are ruins. The workers are memories. Zenith exists only as patents and licensing agreements, but its legacy surrounds us. Every remote control, every high-definition broadcast, every Super Bowl signal. Zenith helped build the modern world. America just didn't notice when it disappeared.